They say the eyes are windows to the soul, but mine had been shuttered for so long that even I had forgotten what light looked like from the inside. At 82, I sit in my small apartment overlooking the harbor, watching seagulls dive for scraps while tourists below point and smile at their graceful arcs. These birds know something I had to learn the hard way. Sometimes you have to plunge into dark waters to find what sustains you. But let me tell you how I spent 47 years feeding everyone else while slowly starving myself. I married young, as most women did, in 1963. He was handsome in that clean-cut way that mothers approved of, worked steady at the plant, and never raised his voice. What more could a 19-year-old girl want? I thought his quietness meant depth, his measured responses wisdom. I confused his emotional absence for stability, his indifference for calm. The first sign should have been our wedding day, when I sobbed tears of joy during our first dance and looked up to find him scanning the room, already calculating how soon we could leave. But young love sees what it wants to see, and I wanted to see a future. The children came quickly. 3 and 5 years. I threw myself into motherhood with the fierce dedication of someone trying to prove something, though I was never quite sure what. I made elaborate birthday parties that he attended but never participated in, sitting in his chair with a beer while I juggled cake cutting, game organizing, and photo taking. I sewed Halloween costumes late into the night while he watched television, the mechanical hum of my machine mixing with canned laughter from whatever show held his attention. When the children cried in the night, I would slip from bed, careful not to wake him. His sleep was sacred. His rest was essential for his work. Mine, apparently, was expendable. The pattern established itself so gradually that I barely noticed it taking root. He would come home, eat the dinner I had prepared, and retreat to his workshop in the basement, or plant himself in front of the television. Conversation became transactional. Did you pick up my shirts? The car needs an oil change. Your mother called again. Each interaction was a checkbox to be marked, a duty to be discharged. I told myself this was normal, that men of his generation just weren't talkers. I made excuses for his absence even when he was sitting right beside me. When I tried to share something that mattered to me, a book I was reading or a news story that concerned me, his eyes would glaze over with the particular kind of polite disinterest reserved for door-to-door salesmen. He perfected the art of the dismissive nod, the grunt that could mean agreement or annoyance or absolutely nothing at all. I learned to read his moods like a meteorologist reads storm systems, adjusting my behavior to avoid the quiet turbulence that followed whenever I disrupted his routine or asked for more than he was willing to give. The children grew up learning this dance too. They would run to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, excitement about school plays and anxiety about tests. They learned not to expect much from their father beyond his physical presence at dinner and his signature on permission slips. I became the interpreter of his silence, the bridge between his emotional unavailability and their need for a father who truly saw them. I would make excuses for him even to them. Daddy's tired from work. Daddy shows love differently. Daddy cares, he just doesn't know how to say it. Years passed like this, each one feeling both eternal and ephemeral. I aged in ways that went beyond the physical. My laughter became rarer, my dreams smaller. I stopped wearing the bright colors I had once loved, gravitating toward beiges and grays that wouldn't draw attention or require comment. I stopped reading novels, stopped listening to music that moved me, stopped doing anything that might generate enthusiasm he would have to pretend to share or, worse, ignore entirely. The loneliness was the hardest part to acknowledge. You're not supposed to be lonely when you're married, when you have children, when your days are full of purpose and duty. But loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being unseen, unheard, unknown by the people who share your life. I could spend entire days talking to him about schedules and grocery lists and never have a single moment of real connection. I could lie beside him every night and feel more isolated than if I were stranded on a desert island. I filled the emptiness with busyness. I volunteered at the church, organized school fundraisers, tended a garden that became my pride and joy. I threw myself into every role except the one I most wanted to matter. Wife to a man who saw me as furniture. Pleasant and useful, but hardly worth noticing, unless I was out of place. I became expert at finding fulfillment in the margins of my life, treasuring stolen moments of joy like secrets. The children left for college and careers, and suddenly, the house felt cavernous. Without their needs to meet and their schedules to coordinate, the silence between us became deafening. Retirement came, and I foolishly hoped it might bring us closer together. Instead, it just meant more hours of the same distant politeness, stretched across longer days. He developed routines that excluded me entirely. Morning coffee alone with the newspaper, afternoon woodworking projects that were off limits to interruption, evening television shows he watched with religious devotion while I cleaned up from dinner and prepared for the next day. I started taking walks, longer and longer ones, just to feel like I existed outside the walls of our house. I would pass other couples on benches, holding hands or talking animatedly, and feel a stab of envy so sharp it took my breath away. I had never had that. In nearly 5 decades of marriage, I had never experienced the simple pleasure of being truly interesting to my husband, of mattering enough to warrant his full attention. The children called dutifully, but their lives were full and busy. They would ask how Dad was, how I was, and I would give the expected answers. Fine. Keeping busy. Looking forward to your visit. I never told them about the crushing weight of being invisible in my own home, about how their father could spend entire weekends acting as though I were nothing more than a helpful ghost. They had their own families now, their own challenges, and I wouldn't burden them with complaints about a marriage they had always assumed was solid if undemonstrative. My health started declining in small ways. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary indignities of aging. I developed arthritis in my hands that made gardening painful. I needed reading glasses, then stronger ones. I began taking medication for blood pressure, for cholesterol, for the various systems that were wearing down after 8 decades of use. Each new limitation required adjustments to my routines, accommodations that I made quietly and efficiently, as I had learned to do with everything else. It was during this time that I realized he had stopped seeing me entirely. I could be struggling to open a jar in the kitchen, clearly in pain from my arthritic fingers, and he would walk by without offering help or even acknowledging my difficulty. I could mention that I had fallen in the garden and scraped my knee, and he would grunt and ask what was for dinner. I had become so thoroughly invisible that my physical suffering didn't register as something requiring his attention or concern. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember the date because it was our 50th wedding anniversary, a milestone I had been both dreading and hoping might spark some recognition of what we had built together, however imperfect it might be. I had made his favorite breakfast, arranged flowers from my garden in a vase on the table, and put on the blue dress he had once said he liked. Though that compliment was so far in the past, I wasn't even sure I remembered it correctly. He ate breakfast while reading the newspaper, just like every other morning. I waited for some acknowledgement of the day, some small gesture toward the significance of 5 decades spent together. When he finished eating, he folded the paper neatly, pushed back from the table, and headed toward the door. I finally spoke up, my voice smaller and more tentative than I intended. I mentioned what day it was, reminded him of the anniversary. He stopped at the door, turned back with that familiar expression of mild irritation that meant I was disrupting his routine. He said he knew what day it was, that he wasn't senile yet, and asked if I expected him to make a big fuss about it. The dismissal in his voice was casual, automatic, as though my hope for recognition was an unreasonable demand that barely merited response. But it wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it, with that particular tone that suggested my feelings were an inconvenience he shouldn't have to manage. It was the way he looked at me, not with anger or frustration, but with a kind of weary resignation, as though my very existence was a burden he had learned to tolerate but never appreciate. In that moment, standing in my kitchen, in my best dress, with flowers wilting on the table, I saw myself through his eyes, invisible, irrelevant, easily dismissed. Something shifted inside me that day, like a foundation settling after years of bearing too much weight. I spent the morning sitting at that table, staring at the flowers, and trying to remember the last time he had really looked at me, really listened to something I said, really cared about my thoughts or feelings or experiences. I couldn't recall a single instance in recent memory, maybe not in recent years. The afternoon brought a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. I realized I had been living like a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions of marriage without any of the connection or companionship that should have made it meaningful. I had been so focused on being a good wife, on not making waves, on accepting whatever scraps of attention he threw my way, that I had forgotten I deserved more than mere tolerance from my life partner. That evening, I made dinner as usual, but I also made a decision. I waited until he was settled in his chair with his after-dinner television program, then I sat down across from him and turned off the set. He looked up with annoyed surprise, clearly unprepared for this deviation from routine. I told him we needed to talk, really talk, about our marriage, and what I needed from it to continue. His response was predictably dismissive. He said there was nothing wrong with our marriage, that I was making problems where none existed, that after 50 years we were too old to start having dramatic conversations about feelings. He reached for the remote control to turn the television back on, ready to end the discussion before it had truly begun. But I didn't let him. For the first time in decades, I insisted on being heard. I told him about the loneliness, about feeling invisible and unimportant in our shared life. I explained that I needed conversation, connection, some evidence that my presence in his life mattered beyond my ability to cook and clean and manage the household details he preferred to ignore. I spoke calmly, but firmly, laying out what I needed, with the clarity that comes from reaching your absolute limit. His reaction was everything I had expected and feared. He accused me of being melodramatic, of creating problems for the sake of creating problems. He said I was too old to start acting like a dissatisfied housewife, that our marriage was fine the way it was, that I should be grateful for the stability and security he had provided. He made it clear that he had no intention of changing anything about how we related to each other, that my unhappiness was my problem to solve, not his responsibility to address. The conversation, such as it was, ended with him storming out to his workshop and me sitting alone in the living room, listening to the sound of his power tools, drowning out any possibility of further discussion. But something had changed in me during that confrontation. I had spoken my truth, had asked for what I needed, and had been definitively rejected. The ambiguity was gone. I finally knew exactly where I stood. The next morning, I began making plans. Not dramatic, vengeful plans, but quiet, practical ones. I started by opening my own checking account, something I probably should have done decades earlier. I researched apartments in the area, small places suitable for a single person who didn't need much space, but wanted a sense of peace. I looked into part-time work opportunities, volunteer positions that might provide the human connection and sense of purpose that had been missing from my life. I told no one about these preparations, not even the children. This wasn't about punishment or dramatic gestures. It was about finally taking responsibility for my own happiness instead of waiting for someone else to provide it. I had spent 50 years trying to be enough for a man who was determined to find me insufficient. I was done with that particular form of self-torture. The logistics took several weeks to arrange. I found a small apartment near the harbor, walking distance from the library and several volunteer organizations that could use my help. I arranged for my portion of our retirement funds to be transferred to my new account. I quietly sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, keeping only what mattered to me and donating the rest. During this time, he noticed nothing. I was moving through the house like a woman preparing to disappear, and it didn't register as anything worth his attention. If anything, he seemed pleased that I had stopped trying to engage him in conversation, stopped disrupting his routines with my needs or concerns. He probably thought his firm rejection of my anniversary day concerns had settled the matter once and for all. The day I left, I made breakfast as usual, cleaned up the kitchen, and left a simple note on the table, explaining that I was moving out, that I would be in touch through a lawyer about the practical details of separation, and that I wished him well. I didn't elaborate on my reasons or justify my decision. I had already tried to explain what I needed, and he had made it clear he wasn't interested in providing it. I took only what fit in 2 suitcases in my car. Everything else could be sorted out later, through proper legal channels. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something better. I was choosing myself for the first time in decades, prioritizing my own well-being over his comfort or convenience. The apartment was small but filled with light. Windows faced the harbor, where I could watch boats come and go, seagulls dive and soar, tourists discover new perspectives on familiar sights. I arranged my books on shelves, hung pictures that made me smile, planted herbs on the windowsill that would remind me daily that I could nurture growth in the right conditions. The children were shocked, then concerned, then gradually supportive, as I explained my decision calmly and without bitterness. I told them I had tried for 50 years to make the marriage work, that their father was a good man in many ways, but not someone capable of seeing or appreciating me as a full person. I assured them this wasn't about blame or anger. It was about recognizing that some relationships can't be fixed from one side alone. The legal proceedings were straightforward. He fought me on very little, perhaps because he realized that making it difficult would require him to pay attention to me, something he had spent decades avoiding. We divided our assets fairly, kept our interactions minimal and businesslike. I think he was actually relieved to have his routines restored without the inconvenience of a wife who occasionally wanted to be acknowledged. The first months alone were an adjustment, but not in the ways I had expected. I had worried about loneliness, but I discovered there's a profound difference between being alone and being lonely. I was alone in my apartment, but I wasn't lonely anymore. I wasn't invisible, wasn't dismissed, wasn't constantly adapting myself to accommodate someone else's indifference. I began volunteering at the literacy center, helping adults learn to read. I discovered I had a gift for patience and encouragement that had been largely wasted on someone who didn't want either. I started a small garden on my building's roof, sharing vegetables with neighbors who appreciated both the produce and the effort. I joined a book club, went to lectures at the community college, took art classes that reminded me I could create beauty for no reason other than the joy of creating it. Slowly, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of trying to be what someone else needed. I remembered that I loved music, that I had opinions about politics and books and current events, that I could be funny and insightful and interested in the world around me. I learned that conversations could be exchanges rather than monologues, that other people found me worth listening to, worth knowing. The transformation wasn't instant or complete. There were days when I doubted my decision, when the familiarity of my old life seemed safer than the uncertainty of building a new one. There were moments when I wondered if I had given up too easily, if I should have tried harder to bridge the gap between us. But those doubts became less frequent as I settled into a life that actually felt like mine. Now, 2 years later, I can honestly say I am happier than I have been in decades. I wake up each morning looking forward to the day rather than enduring it. I have friends who know my thoughts and opinions, who seek out my company because they enjoy it rather than because they need something from me. I have activities that fulfill me, routines that bring me pleasure, a home that reflects my tastes and preferences. I think about him sometimes, wondering if he misses me at all or if his life has simply become easier without the inconvenience of a wife who wanted more than he was willing to give. I hope he's well, but I don't regret leaving. I spent 50 years trying to matter to someone who was constitutionally unable to see me as mattering. I finally chose to matter to myself instead. The harbor view from my window changes constantly. Different boats, different weather, different light playing across the water. The seagulls are the constant, always adapting, always finding what they need, always ready to dive when they spot something worth pursuing. I've learned to be more like them, alert to opportunities, willing to take risks for what sustains me, unafraid to soar when the conditions are right. People sometimes ask if I'm bitter about the wasted years, about giving so much of my life to someone who appreciated so little of what I offered. But I'm not bitter. Those years taught me things I needed to know, showed me what I didn't want, clarified what I did need to be happy. They led me here, to this small apartment with harbor views, to this life that finally fits. At 82, I am learning that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to insist on being seen and heard and valued. The eyes that were shuttered for so long are wide open now, taking in light and color and possibility. I'm finally living instead of just existing, finally present in my own life, instead of waiting in the margins for someone else to invite me in. The seagulls outside my window understand something essential about survival. You can't wait for someone else to feed you. Sometimes you have to dive into dark waters, trust your instincts, and find what you need on your own. It took me 8 decades to learn this lesson, but I learned it well. And every morning when I watch them soar against the vast sky, I remember that freedom is always possible, even when you think you've forgotten how to fly.